On the night of January 12, 1971, 2 bombs exploded outside the London home of Robert Carr MP. Carr was Edward Heath's employment minister and the man responsible for the hated Industrial Relations Bill, which had passed into law earlier that day. These bombs were the 18th in a group of 25 armed actions in Britain, claimed by anarchist and libertarian socialist groups, calling themselves the 1st of May Group and the Angry Brigade. The Angry Brigade itself first emerged in the summer of 1970 in the run-up to the election of the Conservative government of Edward Heath, and its activities continued for 18 months. The Angry Brigade actions, intended as symbolic, were followed by communiques explaining why the targets had been chosen and the group's commitment to rank-and-file organisation and international solidarity. Targets included the embassies of repressive regimes, high-profile police stations and army barracks, sweatshop boutiques and factories, as well as government buildings. The homes of cabinet ministers, the Attorney General and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police were also targeted. Scotland Yard and MI5 launched a massive investigation which led, in August 1971, to a number of arrests and 2 major trials at the Old Bailey, in which 3 men and 2 women received heavy jail sentences. 5 others, myself included, were acquitted. Gordon Carr's film for the BBC explores the roots of the Angry Brigade in the context of the revolutionary ferment of the 1960s and follows their campaign and a police investigation to its culmination in the Stoke Newington 8 conspiracy trial at the Old Bailey. It turned out to be the longest criminal trial in British legal history. Carr's 1973 documentary, which begins in 1967 with the machine gunning of the US Embassy in London's Grosvenor Square, remains the most comprehensive account so far of the complex police investigation and the court case that followed. Read no more roads, my son, read timetables, they're to the point, and roll the sea charts out before it's too late. Be watchful, do not sing, for once again the day is clearly coming when they will brand refusers on the chest and nail up lists of names on people's doors. Learn how to go unknown, learn more than me, learn to change your face, your documents, your country. Become adept at every petty treason.
August the 20th, 1967. The time, 11:15. A white Ford Cortina drives down Park Lane in London's West End. In the car, 3 men, young Spanish anarchists. They turn into Grosvenor Square, draw alongside the American Embassy, Four years later, the gun used in that attack was found under a table in an Angry Brigade commune in North London. How it got there, who handled it as it passed from group to group, sums up the development of anarchism, once the sole concern of a few Spanish expatriates, to a movement that introduced a new form of urban guerrilla activity that grew till the lives of cabinet ministers were seriously at risk. It was from here, in the back streets of Brussels, among the thousands of migrant workers from all over Europe, and especially from Spain, that the attack on the Grosvenor Square embassy was planned. Planned principally by this man, Octavio Alberola, a Spanish-born anarchist, a dedicated revolutionary, known to the security services in at least 3 countries as one of the most dangerous men in Europe. In Britain, he's seen as the contact man and father figure of the group that became the Angry Brigade. Like many other Spanish exiles before him, Alberola found Belgium a tolerant country, reasonably safe from the attentions of the Spanish secret police, and with its anarchist cafes, bars and clubs, almost like home. At first, Alberola was influenced by an older generation of political militants, traditional anarchists who've often paid a heavy price for their opposition to the Franco regime. Miguel Garcia was sentenced to death, spent weeks in a condemned cell, was reprieved and spent 20 years in jail.
Because we think that the more intelligent people, the ones who have not the right to use this superiority, intelligence superiority, to exploit the other. The same as the one who is stronger physically has not the right to abuse his strongness. That is the way.
Put simply, Garcia's generation want an end to all forms of authority in personal and political life. No government, no legal system, no civil service, no bosses. It's an anarchist ideal that Garcia fought for in the Spanish Civil War and lost. And his generation spent the years that followed in prison, in exile, or engaged in guerrilla resistance against the Franco regime. It was a resistance that ended effectively with the death of the most famous guerrilla of them all, Francisco Sabaté. He was cornered in 1960 by government troops in a farmhouse in the Catalan mountains. He managed to escape badly wounded, but 5 of his companions were killed, and Sabaté himself was caught and later shot. His death was a turning point in the development of anarchist activity in Europe. It brought Miguel Garcia's generation to an end. These were men who'd operated openly in Spain against Spanish targets. But new young men were emerging with new ideas and subject to new influences. Octavio Alberola was one of these new men. Alberola had worked in Mexico with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara preparing the Cuban invasion. And what they'd done in Latin America, he decided to try in Europe. We met him at a secret hideout on the continent, and he agreed to talk about some of his efforts to revive and reshape traditional Spanish anarchism into an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist international movement. Through an interpreter, Alberola told us that soon after Sabaté's death, a new and highly secret organization, known as the DI, the Défense Intérieure, was formed to coordinate these new anarchist developments. And by chance, the DI were helped in their task of internationalizing the Spanish movement by the Spanish government itself.
Were garroted, Delgado and Granados, 2 anarchists in Spain. And there has been a very big repression all over Europe, especially in France and in Italy too, against anti-Franquist militants, but especially anarchists.
The execution of Delgado and Granados got worldwide publicity, and many people were shocked. One young Briton in particular was disturbed by what he felt was excessive Spanish repression. Stuart Christie was brought up in a mining area of southwest Scotland. At the age of 16, he was a member of the Anti-Nuclear Committee of 100. At 17, he joined the Glasgow Federation of Anarchists.
I couldn't stand by and watch as an onlooker and say, well, there's nothing I can do. There was something I could do, and that was take an active part in the resistance.
What did you do?
I approached the resistance organisation, the Libertarian Resistance Organisation, and offered my services.
What did they
ask you? In whatever they saw fit to employ me.
And how was that?
I was employed as a courier transporting explosives between point A and point B, which was Madrid.
And you were picked up in Madrid?
I was picked up in Madrid in August 1964.
And sentenced to 20 years?
I received a sentence of 20 years on the 1st of September. I was tried by a council of war, a military court-martial, which was all over within an hour. In fact, I knew very little of what was actually being said, and nothing, in fact, of what was being said during the proceedings. I wasn't told at the time either what the sentence was. This was passed to me 2 or 3 days later. A little note was slipped under the cell door saying that the probable date of release was 1984, which was I was none too pleased with.
Christie's capture was a sign of just how effective the Spanish secret police had become in penetrating and dealing with the new revitalized anarchist movement. So, to protect themselves, the DI decided to set up totally secret guerrilla cells. Alberola was to be the link between these new cells and the outside world, and he was soon having to justify the exploits of the most notorious of them, the 1st of May group.
Yeah, he says that it's a group of Spanish militants that came from Spain to Italy to make this...
Alberola explained that the group took its name from the day they kidnapped the Spanish legate to the Vatican in Rome in 1966. Soon it was Britain's turn, with that attack in 1967 on the American embassy in Grosvenor Square. 6 months after the Grosvenor Square attack, a message came into Reuters press agency in Fleet Street about an explosion in Turin. Some minutes later, another report from The Hague with details of 3 attacks on Spanish, Italian and Greek property. Then news of an explosion at the Spanish embassy in London, and yet another at the American Officers Club in Lancaster Gate. 6 explosions, 6 locations, 3 countries, and all claimed by the 1st of May group. Years later, the 3 London incidents were regarded by the authorities as the beginnings of the Angry Brigade conspiracy. In the middle of all this 1st of May activity, Octavio Alberola was arrested in Belgium for entering the country illegally. Stuart Christie, now back in Britain after serving just 3 years of his 20-year sentence, began to campaign for him through the International Black Cross, a movement he'd revived to help anarchist prisoners.
In 1967, well, during the period I was in prison, I realised that the only people who were receiving any assistance whatsoever from the outside, that is, outside the organisations the prisoners belonged to, and their immediate families, the only people who received assistance were members of the Communist Party and the Jehovah's Witnesses. Everyone else was forgotten.
In Britain, Christie edited a Black Cross bulletin in collaboration with Albert Meltzer, a lifelong anarchist who'd worked with him on a book, The Floodgates of Anarchy. Christie's Black Cross organisation soon caught on abroad. It was, and still is, in operation in more than a dozen countries, and 3 of its representatives have died in conflict with the authorities. It was largely because of Stuart Christie's connections with the Black Cross movement that in Britain the security services had already made up their minds that it was Christie who'd import revolutionary ideas and spread them among the country's youth. But in their concern to keep an eye on Christie, they overlooked the parallel and much more important influence coming into Britain from quite another direction. In the early 60s, the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco had become a gathering point for young student dropouts who suddenly felt that wherever they'd come from, and that was usually a well-ordered, well-off, secure home, was no longer the place to stay. They wanted an alternative to the materialist, consumer-based, authoritarian society offered by an older generation. They experimented with drugs, dress, food, anything that got away from middle class, middle morality, middle America. Towards the end of the 60s, this American attempt to revolutionize lifestyle met up with Europe's revitalized anarchism. It was an explosive mixture, sparked off by just a handful of students at one university. At Nanterre, on the outskirts of Paris, at the beginning of 1968, a dozen or so students, calling themselves Les Enragés, the Angry Ones, a name they'd borrowed from the French Revolution, were what's known as situationists. Their ideas are complex, but their techniques are simple. You create a situation. Anything will do, so long as it annoys the authorities enough to make them react. You then turn that reaction to your own advantage. At Nanterre, the situationists did just that. The students wanted educational reforms. The situationists backed them up by pelting the professors with fruit, interrupting lectures. As they'd hoped, eventually 2 of them were expelled. Riots broke out, protesting against their dismissal. The effect had been achieved. Within a matter of weeks, the riots had spread from Nanterre to the streets of Paris itself. Soon the Sorbonne itself was totally in the hands of the students, and not just those who'd been studying there. Hundreds joined in from all over Europe, including, of course, from Britain. Christopher Bott, acquitted at the Angry Brigade trial 4 years later, was one person drawn to Paris that year.
Well, in the slogan of the times, the imagination was seizing power over in France. I could only sense this from what I saw in the newspapers, but I knew that there was a social revolution going on, where real forms of liberation were taking place. And I was comparing that with the boring, dull, stultified atmosphere of Britain at that particular time. Comparing that to France, where the revolutionary forces were not small groups of middle-class radicals, but 10 million people who'd taken the factories, millions of people who were on the streets. And over here, comparing it to the passive, easy consumption of a life behind the television screen.
Bott and the young people with him heard among the dozens of attempts to draw up some kind of revolutionary policy the views of people like Danny Cohn-Bendit, and of course the views of the situationists. Abolish all hierarchies, shut down the universities, take over the factories. Other groups didn't agree. The arguments were long, often heated. Another young Briton in Paris that year was particularly impressed by the situationists. John Barker, then at Cambridge, began to translate some of their pamphlets. Barker was eventually deported from France and went back to Cambridge full of situationist ideas. He wasn't there to see the whole revolutionary movement collapse into a trade union demand for a pay rise. To those like Barker, inspired by events in Paris to work for the new order, it was all sadly dispiriting. But there was one last hope. A huge anti-Vietnam War demonstration had been organized for October that year in Grosvenor Square. 100,000 people were expected to march through the streets of London in another international and possibly revolutionary event. But with Paris very much in mind, the authorities took no chances, and as the demonstrators crowded into Grosvenor Square itself, the police were there in strength and managed to control the proceedings for most of the time. Once again, the established order had stood firm, and for those who were hoping to get from the demonstration some kind of revolutionary situation, it was a disappointment. They realized now that big demonstrations were a waste of time. The authorities had learnt how to cope with them. What was needed now, they felt, was a much more direct challenge to society, if necessary, outside the law.
Was wollen Sie denn jetzt? Wie wollen Sie sich aus dieser Situation befreien? Es gibt keine Chance für Sie.
It was in West Germany that the first evidence of this new-style confrontation with the state emerged following the disappointments of Paris and Grosvenor Square. The Baader-Meinhof group, or Red Army Fraction as they're sometimes called, decided quite simply to declare war on German society. The police were held at bay for almost 2 years, and as an example of how a small urban guerrilla group could terrorize a whole country, the Baader-Meinhof people were impressive. Not until the arrest of Andreas Baader himself in a Frankfurt suburb was the back of the resistance finally broken. But it wasn't only in Germany that these small guerrilla groups were forming themselves. Even Switzerland had one, so did the Dutch and the Turks. The Italians had a total of 145 explosions in 1969 alone. Britain had its Spanish-influenced 1st of May group, and in fact, after a bomb attempt in March 1969 at the Bank of Bilbao in Covent Garden, 2 1st of May men were caught with a communique in their pockets. But in Britain, other forms of urban violence were growing. In August 1969, in London, a petrol bomb was thrown at the Ulster office. And though not much of an incident on its own, in fact it was crucial to the development and the fate of the Angry Brigade itself. Ian Purdy, who'd been active in protest movements for a number of years, was arrested and charged with throwing the bomb. He was sentenced to 9 months and later sent to Albany Prison in the Isle of Wight. There he met Jake Prescott, a small-time criminal and drug addict who'd lived in institutions for most of his life. Purdy struck up a friendship with Prescott and began to interest him in politics.
He realised that one could
Ian Purdy.
change from struggling as an individual, which he's done all his life, struggled against his conditions, struggled against things that he's been subjected to, but as an individual, and he realised, I think, that struggling collectively is more coherent. Struggling collectively has more strength, has more power, and this leads further into struggling with his class, which is basically how he did change, I think, or how his attitudes changed, how he came to realise that there were different forms of struggle.
While Purdy was educating Prescott in Albany Prison, outside the 1st of May group were making the headlines again with another concerted attack, this time at airports in 4 countries flying Spanish Iberia Airlines. At Heathrow, a hold-all with a bomb in it was taken off an Iberia plane after someone had called Scotland Yard. Then, just 12 days after this, came the first sign that the 1st of May, as a violent revolutionary group, were not alone. Scientists at the forensic laboratory at Woolwich discovered that an unexploded bomb found at the site of the new Paddington police station had a makeup almost identical to its 1st of May predecessors. But the target was obviously different. There was nothing remotely Spanish about Paddington police station. Obviously the 1st of May group were lending their explosives, if not their expertise, to someone else. In the months that followed, more bombs or their fragments were examined at Woolwich, and forensic experts began to notice a distinct pattern to them. It was the targets that defied definition. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the Attorney General, a BBC outside broadcast van at the Miss World contest, the Department of Employment and Productivity. And though the security services, the police and the special branch didn't realise it at the time, the answer in fact lay in the people, the politics and the new lifestyles that were developing from the mixture of the American hippie movement and Europe's Alberola-style revolutionary anarchism. Again, it was in West Germany that this new libertarianism first caught on, and it was there that it claimed its first martyr, Georg von Rauch. Von Rauch was Stuart Christie's equivalent in the International Black Cross organization in West Germany. And it was von Rauch, more than anyone else, who fired the imagination of the revolutionary movement that was developing out of the '68 events. These people admired the way the Baader-Meinhof group had taken up the challenge to society, and they organized themselves to help them. If the group were at the top of the pyramid, then these people are the base, thousands who, though they wouldn't necessarily let off a bomb themselves, are sympathetic to those who do.
The song is dedicated to people from the Angry Brigade, England. It's dedicated to the people in Germany who've been killed for police, killed, Tony and Nick.
The words and the music are anti-authoritarian, anti-society. This isn't the sound of protest, it's the sound of revolution. The musicians themselves live together in a commune, playing out a political as well as a social role. The commune, in fact, is the fundamental unit of the whole revolutionary libertarian idea. This particular commune, raided by the police a dozen times in the hunt for Baader-Meinhof suspects, was built from an old leather factory by the people who lived there. It's the commune experience, they say, that's important. You can't expect people brought up in the old society to fit into the alternative without some drastic changes. And for that, it's essential first to break down the family unit, to develop non-family relationships. But of course, liberated women have children, and a great deal of care is put into bringing them up to fit into the world they want. Commune children eat, sleep and play together. Outside the commune, they join in what's known as kindergarten. Originally, these groups were set up to allow commune mothers more time to attend political demonstrations. But a system soon began to build itself into the plan. The children were encouraged to develop free from any kind of inhibition, free from any competitive instinct. In Britain, these experiments in revolutionary lifestyle were slower to catch on. But when they did, it was in the Notting Hill area of West London that they first took root. In a very small way, the district became the nearest Britain had to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. It was, and in some senses still is, a centre for dissident student dropouts, for anyone who wants to go to extremes in social and political life without too much attention from his neighbours, if not from the authorities. It was to this environment that Jake Prescott came after his release from Albany prison to put into practice the kind of politics Ian Purdy had been telling him about. Prescott began to mix with people who were beginning to organise themselves into revolutionary cells, and not only here in the decaying Victorian tenements of Notting Hill, but also in Manchester and Edinburgh. Soon there were more bombs, and then in December 1970 came the first clue to what was happening. A communique was sent to the International Times claiming the bomb attacks, and it was signed Angry Brigade, the first time the words had been used. The communique also claimed a machine gun attack on the Spanish embassy. Later, the gun, a .38 Beretta, was proved ballistically to be the same gun that was used on the American embassy 3 years earlier. So here was direct evidence of a link between the 1st of May group and people now calling themselves the Angry Brigade. And as if to emphasise the point, just a month later, on January the 12th, 1971, came the most serious incident yet. 2 bombs went off at the home in Barnet of the then Secretary for Employment and Productivity, Mr. Robert Carr. And for the Angry Brigade, it was a serious error of judgment. Up to now, the bombings had been largely the preoccupation of the security services and the special branch. The explosions at Barnet were on an altogether different scale, and they brought in for the first time trained investigators, CID men led by Detective Chief Superintendent Roy Habershon.
The second bomb went off shortly afterwards, after the family had evacuated the house, and whilst Mr. Carr and some police officers who'd been summoned to the scene were actually standing there. And it was only because the bomb flared a little that they were able to take cover. So we had the situation where 2 unstable bombs had gone off in circumstances which, as far as I was concerned, amounted to attempted murder.
But in his hunt for the bombers, Mr. Habershon had some formidable problems, not least the vast communications gap between the police and the people they were dealing with. During one raid on the offices of the magazine Time Out, Special Branch detectives had the embarrassing experience of having to explain why they were there on film.
Well, in fact, you're a member of the Special Branch, aren't you?
I'm here as a police officer to do a specific job. There are official channels that you can go through, and I'm not one of them. But seriously, I think it's a bit... you can appreciate my position. How can I possibly say anything about it? I don't know the circumstances, and if I did, I wouldn't discuss them anyway.
The police were often shocked by the lifestyle of the people they raided. Some of the communes they went into were far from the standards of hygiene and organisation reached in Germany. And there were shocks too for the people being raided. For many it was their first taste of police methods. They didn't like being woken up in the middle of the night. They objected to the searching, and they were not the least bit sympathetic to what the police were trying to do.
Well, this was a popular cry from the people that we were investigating, that we were merely harassing them for their left-wing views. This was not the case. As I say, I had to get amongst these people because the responsibility for the bombing clearly lay in this area. I had to get amongst them, I had to put my men amongst them, and my view at that time, and I still hold this view, that if people go about preaching violence and revolution, and a bombing of this sort occurs in that context, then they must expect to be the object of police attention.
But what sort of violence and revolution was it that the Angry Brigade were preaching? Well, much of what it was all about was in a newspaper a group of young people were preparing in Liverpool. Among them were John Barker, the Cambridge undergraduate who'd been so impressed by the Situationists in Paris, Jim Greenfield, a friend of Barker's at Cambridge and academically quite bright, and 2 girls, Anna Mendelssohn, who'd done English literature at Essex University, She'd also been to Paris in '68, and Hilary Creek, another Essex student who'd taken part in university sit-ins and demonstrations. The four of them took part in the editing and compiling of Strike, contributing to the areas they were particularly interested in. Greenfield, Barker and Creek, for example, somewhat ironically as it turned out, wrote the section on judges and the law, advising people how to defend themselves. But whatever the hodgepodge of ideas expressed in the paper, one thing was clear. They were different from traditional left-wing views on almost every level.
Marxist system is a better system. Capitalist system is a bad system. As a black man,
The people behind Strike believed that the communists, in doctrine as well as in their papers, were always telling people what to do, devising policies for them, instead of getting out into the community, involving themselves, living with people and sharing their experiences. The way the four people involved with Strike did this was through the squatting movement. Taking over empty property, living there and helping others to move in offered the kind of direct action that many young people were looking for. Many more were active in the claimants' unions, groups, there are about some 60 throughout the country, who make it their job to see that those with social security claims actually get what's due to them. And as many of the people involved in these movements are on social security themselves, like squatting, the claimants' union is another example of self-help and self-organisation. The political idea behind squatting and the claimants' union is to make people on the fringes of society aware of their situation and to fight it. In other words, to politicise them. If you can do that, the argument goes, to the homeless, the unemployed, the aged, to the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, even to the criminal fraternity, if you can politicise everyone who feels oppressed by society, then you've got on hand a vast revolutionary army, an army that will grow, they believe, until society as we know it collapses. And that society is what they call the spectacular society. It's a phrase the Situationists used in Paris in '68, and it's defined in a book written by a Frenchman, Guy Debord. It's this book that John Barker had begun to translate before he was arrested. Briefly, what it says is that the world we see is the world we've been conditioned to see. And that conditioning, whether it's communist or capitalist, has brainwashed us into accepting material things as a substitute for real experience. It's made us lose the ability to relate to each other as human beings. And this, the book argues, is an act of violence. The Angry Brigade claimed that they were simply matching that violence, the violence of the state, with a violence of their own. And in communiques now sent out after every attack, they outlined the area of their activities. At last it began to put a whole series of bomb attacks stretching back 2 years into some kind of perspective. Embassies first, the American, Spanish and Italian. These were obviously targets inspired by the 1st of May group. Next on the list, judges. In fact, the nearest they got was the Attorney General, Sir Peter Rawlinson, with a bomb at the door of his London home. High pigs, as the communique called the police. That was Sir John Waldron, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. There was a bomb at his London home. Then the Situationist targets, the so-called spectacles. Bieber's Boutique was one example. The communique that went with it complained about the outdated, pointless fashions and about the boring life of the painted salesgirls. Another spectacle was the Miss World contest, with a bomb at the BBC van to coincide with a women's liberation demonstration outside. As for property, there were dozens of attacks on banks, Conservative committee rooms, territorial army centres, even on a computer. Not all the communiques were in this short staccato style. Some were 1,000 words long, well argued, closely reasoned. And as well as giving some idea of the politics behind the attacks, they were forcing people in other revolutionary groups to define their attitudes to violence as well. Brian Michaels was prominent in the Stoke Newington 8 Defence Committee set up to help with the Angry Brigade's defence. Chris Allen was charged with Angry Brigade offences. He was dismissed from the case at the start of the committal proceedings. Ian Purdy stood trial on Angry Brigade conspiracy charges with Jake Prescott. He was acquitted. Prescott was sentenced to 15 years. Jane Greetham was one of many women prominent in defending the Angry Brigade.
I think the Angry Brigade sort of saw that there were a lot of things wrong and really wanted to change things in a way. We felt very frustrated and that sort of the attacks of the Angry Brigade, and they were attacks, that's clear, were an attempt to sort of release some of that frustration that a lot of people felt.
I mean, I think actually calling it, trying to specify it in terms of releasing frustration is perhaps incorrect.
Yeah.
I mean, rather more I see it was got to talk about the fact that, you know, the ruling class actually just define violence in terms of a violent picket or a violent crime or a violent bank robbery or a violent bomb going off somewhere or other, which totally distorts the real essence of what violence is.
I think in some ways, you know, it can, the whole question of violence, state violence and Angry Brigade violence, because I mean I think one can actually talk specifically about Angry Brigade violence.
Yeah.
It's sort of best expressed in a way, or crystallises itself best in a way. When you look at Carr, I know on January the 12th, and I know about that experience very intensely because I was charged with it, because I had all the information more or less that was available to the police about it in terms of my interrogation, what I learned there, in terms of the depositions which one saw and the evidence that came out, that it was directly confronting the state at that stage, and it was a struggle against the Industrial Relations Bill, which later became law. It was confronting Carr violently with the violence of which he was responsible for.
In West Germany, the violent confrontation between the authorities and the Baader-Meinhof group had grown to such proportions that to cope with it, the West German Secret Service was increased from 1,000 agents to 1,500. They pulled men and women out of Iron Curtain countries, retrained them and put them into their own universities. Their experience in dealing with the group and the information they've gleaned in the process has led the security authorities to regard the threat of urban guerrilla activity in general as greater to the stability of the country than anything the communists could offer. They reckon the days have gone when the power struggle is state against state. Now they